Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I want to also express my gratitude, those of you who are here just as listeners for this conference, this symposium, but especially the presenters from, some of them came from California, from Spain, also quite a few from Spain, actually. And also I want to say hi to whoever is following us through Zoom from Spain. And also our many thanks to the Department of Public Programs here, Karen Sander and her team, Jimmy Koch and Tim Ellis, and many others for making this possible. And it's a great pleasure to open this conference, this symposium on Paco de Lucia and the Americas. The idea was thrown back and forth between Mayra and I, and then we bounced the idea also with Miguel Marin, who is the founder and director of the Flamenco Festival New York. And we thought that it would be a great idea to have a symposium on the influence of Paco de Lucia on the Americas music, but also vice versa. And perhaps even more interesting, how this man, Paco de Lucia, who transformed music in so many different ways, essentially came to New York, to the Americas, at a very, very, very early age, and he absorbed, as a sponge, if I might say that, he absorbed whatever was happening in New York in the 70s. Paco de Lucia, the first time he came here, he was 13, 14, I think, and he came as a backup musician for Jose Greco as a dance show, and that influence, that training, if you want, was fundamental. And that's kind of the premise of this symposium, how New York specifically, but the Americas in general, transformed the music of Paco, but also Paco transformed all music in any genre and any style. We know that Paco, he did classical music, jazz, flamenco, traditional. He was one of the founding fathers also of the Nuevo Flamenco, etc., etc. So anyway, so that's basically the idea of this symposium. And again, many thanks to everyone who has collaborated and helped us to put together this symposium. And as you know, you have the program. It's a long day, so we're going to be here for many hours. And some of us are going to be here for many hours. But at the end of the symposium, there is a concert also at 7 p.m. and hopefully many of you will stay for the concert. Okay, so thank you so much. And now Mayra is going to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I want to add that some of the people that we're going to be hearing from later today are people that worked with Paco and knew Paco, and they're going to be talking about, for example, René Heredia is going to talk to us later today about how he brought the legacy of Sabicas back to Spain from the United States. So there's like a very interesting, there are a whole bunch of interesting comings and goings between the Americas and Spain as flamenco grows and blossoms as an international art form. So I want to thank everybody. I want to echo Antoni's thanks for everyone. I want to thank Flamenco Vivo Carlota Santana for helping us promote this event as well. And most importantly, I want to thank the Foundation for Iberian Music and Antoni Pizan, because I want to just talk to you a little bit about our history together. I think it was like around 2013. I went up to Antoni. I don't remember, we did something together. And I said, Antoni, let's do a conference on the fandango. And he said, okay. and it was like so much work. Antoni has taught me so much, and he's a taskmaster, I will warn you, but he has taught me so much, and we have produced so much. So I just brought this one book, which is one of 3 books that we have. There are also 2 online conference proceedings, which are open access and bilingual. This is called The Global Reach of the Fandango in Music, Song, and Dance. And we brought together in that first conference that we did, which was in 2015 here, we brought together scholars and artists from not only, the United States and not only from Spain, but also from the Americas. We had a bunch of really distinguished scholars from Latin America. So that was like super cool. And this is another one of our series. So I just wanted to say, I want to ask for a big round of applause and appreciation for Antoni for all that you do in this community.
I think it's very important also to acknowledge that this conference is made possible by the funds from the Elebash Global Voices Fund. So thank you to them. And as I said, thank you to the Department of Public Programs here at the Graduate Center. So without any further ado, we're going to hear now a little message that Gabriela Canseco has sent us. She was invited and she couldn't come, and she has sent us this little video. Gabriela is the widow of the late Paco de Lucia, and she's also the co-president of the Paco de Lucia Foundation.
Muy buenas tardes. Soy Gabriela Canseco, la viuda de Paco de Lucía y vicepresidenta de la Fundación Paco de Lucía. Me da muchísimo gusto poder estar con ustedes un momentito, aunque sea por este medio. Me hubiera encantado estar allí, pero desde Madrid le doy la enhorabuena a Miguel Marín por su festival y por esta iniciativa, que este coloquio me parece realmente muy interesante, con personas muy bien elegidas que conocen a Paco en profundidad, conocen su obra, conocen de flamenco y incluso grandes amigos de Paco. Esto es una combinación excelente para seguir avanzando en el conocimiento de la obra de Paco, que hay que seguir haciendo investigación sobre eso. Yo no puedo aportar nada musicalmente, es obvio, pero les puedo comentar lo que yo viví con Paco, que era que siempre estaba contando anécdotas de sus viajes a Estados Unidos. Nueva York fue un lugar clave para él. Pasaron muchas cosas allí desde que fue su primera gira y él se hizo mayor ahí en ese lugar. Él maduró con su hermano, haciendo de comer dentro de las habitaciones para mandar más dinero a sus padres, para ahorrar, o haciendo gamberradas con la compañía. Esas no, esas que se las cuente un amigo muy cercano que está por allí. Imitando a Sabicas, también eso lo puede hacer el mismo amigo. Siempre estaba imitando a Sabicas, era muy gracioso. Era algo muy presente en su vida. Y después, en toda Latinoamérica, pues también tenía mucho interés. Le encantaba ir a Brasil a escuchar música. Cuba, nosotros nos fuimos a vivir a Cuba, en gran parte por la música. Él, un mes antes de fallecer, quedó con Juan Formey de hacer una colaboración. Así que también podemos pensar en Perú, en México, o sea, muchas influencias. Y me da mucho gusto que hagan este coloquio enfocado en América. Me parece que eso va a hacer avanzar el conocimiento sobre Paco y estoy ya impaciente de leer la transcripción de este coloquio. Pues les agradezco muchísimo. Recordamos a Paco en sus 10 años de haberse ido. Paco sigue vivo, o sea, realmente está clarísimo que entre sus compañeros de flamenco hay un cariño. Paco sigue vivo. Así que sigamos en esto, ¿no? Trabajando y acordándonos y estudiando a Paco, que aún tiene mucho por enseñarnos.
Well, thank you so much, Gabriela. I'm not sure if you're listening in or watching us through Zoom from Spain, but we're very, very grateful that you were able to send this. I think that those of you who don't, maybe you didn't understand the Spanish, one of the things that she highlighted is that indeed the Americas were very important in the career of and in the development of Paco de Lucia as a musician. So without any further ado, we could start with our session number 1. Okay, so we have session number 1, Mareas de la Mar Morena, Paco de Lucia and the Americas. And we have 3 presenters, Lourdes Maria Luque Garcia, Benjamin Lapidus, and John Moore. Let me introduce, you have Lourdes' biography, but I'll be happy just to go over it. Okay, sorry about that. So Lourdes is the head culture critic at Cadena Ser Radio. She has been her natural medium. She is from Cordoba, based in Sevilla. Her voice has been familiar for 2 decades to music radio listeners and to all of Andalusia, whom she invites every Sunday to enjoy culture in the program she directs and presents, Agenda Cultural de Andalucía on Cadena Ser. Her smile is also well known and beloved for television viewers, in appearances first on Localia TV and currently on 7TV Andalusia, where she interviews and participates in cultural gatherings in the program Acento Andaluz, directed by Fernando Fernández Monguió. She also writes for Correo de Andalucía and has also served as a presenter at numerous institutional events, concerts, musical galas, and awards ceremonies. So welcome, Lourdes. Lourdes is going to speak a little bit, and she's also going to present she brought some visuals, and so we're going to watch whatever she brought. Thank you. Okay.
Hello, good morning to everyone. First of all, let me please thank Meira and Tony, the Foundation for Iberian Music, for inviting me to this symposium to talk about the great Paco de Lucia. I am delighted to be here. We are not just anywhere, but this place, this city, New York, was so important and determining in Paco de Lucia's career. I have brought you a small audiovisual piece of work, which I have done with a lot of love and respect. Not being an expert on flamenco, I have all the same tried to show how I perceive Paco's influence in music, assisted by the testimony of musicians for whom Paco de Lucia was a mentor. I have produced this little piece with the help and collaboration of artists such as José Carlos Gómez, Andrés Hernández Pituquete, Carlos Llave, Pepe Vejines, Montse Altemir, or Jaime Navarro. I truly hope you will enjoy it.
La habilidad de Paco de Lucía a la hora de fusionar el flamenco con otros géneros le hizo único. Este genio andaluz, nacido en Algeciras, en el sur de Europa, tocó la guitarra como nadie, un instrumento universal que el maestro Sabicas mostró por primera vez aquí, en Nueva York, y con el que Paco, erigido como su mayor embajador, sedujo no solo al público, sino también a músicos de todo el mundo, impulsándoles a explorar nuevas direcciones sonoras. Juan Goytisolo escribió que la cultura se fortifica a través del contacto y el mestizaje con diferentes grupos humanos. Paco de Lucía, con su virtuosismo y su enfoque innovador, dejó su sello en los trabajos en los que colaboró, dándole al flamenco una nueva dimensión o un aire flamenco a estilos como el jazz, el rock o el pop, según se mire. Esta labor humanitaria fue puesta en valor con distintos premios a lo largo de su carrera, como el Príncipe de Asturias al Mérito de las Bellas Artes en 1992 o los reconocimientos de doctor honoris causa por la Universidad de Cádiz en 2009 y por el Berklee College of Music of Boston, en Massachusetts, en 2010. Abruma ese vasto camino que él llevó a cabo. Por eso quiero mostraros mi mirada desde fuera del flamenco y también la de los que se inspiraron en él. Me he detenido en algunas de sus obras que yo considero claves en la gesta de este artista tan detallista y completo, el gran Paco de Lucía, uno de nuestros artistas más universales. Empezamos este recorrido en 1973. Ese año se publica Fuente y Caudal, el disco con el que Paco alcanza la perfección técnica, la máxima rapidez, pero un trabajo que, tal y como narra César Suárez en su libro El Enigma, pasa desapercibido en un principio. Aquí quiero poner el foco en la relevancia de la radio musical en esa época. Sí, ese medio que es mi vida y por el que hoy estoy aquí. El periodista y promotor Jesús Quintero decide apostar por ese álbum cuando está a punto de ser descatalogado. Se emite en la radio y la gente lo respalda hasta llevarlo al número 1. Fue esa rumbita la que se metió a última hora en el disco porque faltaba un tema, Entre dos aguas, la responsable de ese boom. El recorrido se hace por los cauces del pop, en un momento histórico en el que ya habían triunfado éxitos como Achilipú de Dolores Vargas, prima del gran Sabicas, o Te estoy amando locamente de Las Grecas. Y así llega a todas las tiendas de discos europeas, poniendo el flamenco en órbita por todo el mundo. Entre dos aguas llega al gran público, a gente ajena al flamenco, y aún hoy sigue siendo la rumba más internacional y su tema más popular. Se puede escuchar adaptada al ukelele en un colegio de un pueblo sevillano mientras unos alumnos preparan la celebración del Día Mundial del Flamenco. Hay muchas versiones de este tema tan universal y como tal podemos encontrarlo adaptado a cualquier instrumento, interpretado, por ejemplo, por los artistas del gremio. Una charanga o brass band de Zaragoza de 9 músicos con 4 álbumes publicados que han participado en varias bandas sonoras y que tienen colaboraciones internacionales. Aquí nos invitan a la fiesta y a la interacción con su estilo tan genuino. El músico algecireño Carlos Llave divide su amor entre la guitarra flamenca y la eléctrica. Ha tenido la suerte de tocar y grabar para el disco Familia de Camarón con los músicos del Sexteto de Paco. Y después de estudiar el grado superior de guitarra flamenca en Córdoba, prepara su disco basado en la música del genio de Algeciras, adaptada a la guitarra eléctrica, el tema de su trabajo de fin de grado.
La música de Paco de Lucía trasciende el flamenco, trasciende la guitarra, trasciende cualquier género. Su música está a la altura de genios como Mozart, Beethoven, en definitiva del resto de genios, ¿no?, que ha dado la música. Ahora estoy en proceso de grabar mi primer disco, que se va a llamar I Just Wanna Fly. Llevo la música de Paco de Lucía a la guitarra eléctrica, acompañado de bajo, batería y teclas. Nos lo llevamos al jazz, al neo soul, al R&B, y siguiendo esa idea que tengo, ¿no?, de la música de Paco, que tiene tanta fuerza que traspasa cualquier género. Te la puedes llevar donde sea y sigue llegando al oído y al alma del que la escuche. Para mí, que soy de Algeciras, Paco ha sido omnipresente en mi vida, tanto su figura como su persona, como su música. Lo que nos ha dejado Paco es tan inmenso que pasarán muchísimos años y seguirá sonando, ¿no?, porque es una música atemporal. Sigo estudiando todos los días, sigo aprendiendo del maestro, su música, en sus vídeos, en sus entrevistas. Mi trabajo de fin de carrera fue sobre la adaptación de la música de Paco de Lucía a otros géneros, cómo adaptaba Paco su música de los discos al sexteto. Ese sexteto que prácticamente, a pesar de hacer flamenco, tenía un concepto de banda de rock, ¿no? Era equiparable para mí a artistas de la época, ¿no?, como Deep Purple, no sé, Led Zeppelin, que era a finales 70-80, ¿no? Era una banda de rock haciendo flamenco, prácticamente. Sigo estudiando su obra, su figura, porque es una fuente inagotable, ¿no?, de conocimiento.
Paco dio protagonismo a sus músicos. En 1975 se convierte en el único guitarrista flamenco que se acompaña por un grupo en toda regla. Un bajo, un laúd, se unen a las melodías de Paco de Lucía en su disco Almoraima. Ahí estaba la emblemática y moruna bulería que daba título a ese disco. Así la interpreta el violinista búlgaro Vasko Vasilev, incluida en su disco Pasión Flamenca. Músicos como él han contribuido a la difusión de la influencia de Paco de Lucía y a la integración de elementos flamencos en distintas tradiciones musicales europeas. También en Latinoamérica, la genialidad de Paco ha trascendido fronteras y ha dejado una huella significativa allí. Numerosos artistas latinoamericanos han incorporado elementos de la música de Paco de Lucía en sus propias creaciones. La influencia de su genialidad y su legado sigue inspirando a generaciones de artistas en países como México, Argentina, Perú o Chile, tierra de Andrés Hernández Pituquete.
Soy Andrés Hernández Infante, más conocido como Pituquete, guitarrista flamenco, nacido y criado en Santiago de Chile, pero gaditano de adopción. El desencadenante de que hoy en día esté en Andalucía viviendo de la guitarra flamenca, con una comunidad de más de 100.000 suscriptores en YouTube y una academia online de más de 3.000 alumnos por el mundo, fue Paco de Lucía. En Latinoamérica en particular, el viaje de Paco de Lucía fue de ida y vuelta, porque trajo desde Perú el cajón flamenco, tomó acordes nuevos de Brasil, sobre todo de sus encuentros con el maestro Rafael Ravelo. De Centroamérica y de Cuba trajo el aire de la rumba, y a su vez dejó en Latinoamérica una tierra que en su esencia es el mestizaje, al igual que Andalucía. La guitarra se toca en todos los países y es parte fundamental de su folclore. Paco dejó allí una semilla de flamencura, de salvajismo, de algo popular pero erudito a la vez, y ha hecho que genios de la guitarra de Latinoamérica como Yamandú Costa se hayan criado con la figura de Paco de Lucía como un referente del carácter que tiene que tener un guitarrista de raíz popular. Cuando pensamos en los toques y en los cantes de ida y vuelta tendemos a pensar en el pasado. Pero esa es una historia que se sigue escribiendo, mientras figuras como Paco de Lucía tracen puentes y se vuelvan universales. El maestro del folclore argentino Atahualpa Yupanqui decía que el paisano es aquel que lleva el paisaje dentro. Y Paco de Lucía llevó a Andalucía Cádiz y Algeciras por el mundo entero. Si ahora estoy diciendo estas palabras es porque en algún momento los vientos del Atlántico llegaron hasta los Andes, con unos sones de guitarra que entraron en mi soñar, en mi sentir y en mi destino. El último concierto de Paco de Lucía en Cádiz fue aquí, en el Castillo de San Sebastián. Y el último concierto de su vida fue en Santiago de Chile. Y su último aliento en la Riviera Maya de México. El flamenco no tiene fronteras. Y nuestra labor es cuidar, regar y hacer crecer esa semilla que Paco sembró en miles y miles de corazones del mundo. Un abrazo.
El diálogo entre el flamenco y la música de América Latina, la India o África evidencian la versatilidad y la apertura de Paco de Lucía hacia diversas influencias musicales. ¿Se preguntan por qué la música de Paco es universal? ¿Por qué toca el corazón de cualquiera que le escucha? Sus composiciones estimulan las áreas cerebrales más desarrolladas del ser humano y contribuyen a su crecimiento. La neurofisioterapeuta sevillana Montserrat Altemir lleva 25 años trabajando con pacientes con daño cerebral.
He visto pacientes que después de un ictus podían tararear pero no hablar, tartamudos que dejaban de hacerlo al cantar. El ritmo es matemáticas, los músicos se hablan con las partituras y Paco de Lucía fue un científico, un médico, un sanador, tantas profesiones a la vez. Paco fue el Premio Nobel de la Música, que nos abría el cofre del recuerdo de nuestros sentimientos más profundos, evocando nuestro cerebro primitivo y límbico, como a su vez la corteza frontal y más elaborada y desarrollada, estimulando el crecimiento de nuestras funciones neuronales más superiores. Con su música compleja, Paco nos hacía mejores.
Paco se ganó al público y a la crítica. El gigante Eric Clapton lo definió en su libro Guitarra, Música, Historia e Intérpretes como una figura titánica de la música flamenca. Un genio excepcional en todos los sentidos, equiparable a otros creadores como Mozart. Inspiró muchos trabajos posteriores. Otro guitarrista algecireño, el gran José Carlos Gómez, nos muestra algunos.
Una de las cualidades más grandes que tenía Paco de Lucía, entre tantas que tenía, porque era un artista tan completo, yo creo que era la capacidad de hacer melodías. Él siempre estaba buscando cantar con la guitarra, ¿no? Y tenía una gran capacidad para hacer unas melodías muy bonitas, ¿no? Y muchos creadores se fijaron en estas melodías y se inspiraron o directamente copiaron trozos para sus propias obras, ¿no? En este primer ejemplo os voy a poner las alegrías del disco de Camarón Soy Gitano, unas alegrías que se titulan Casida de las Palomas Oscuras. Y este fragmento está inspirado en las alegrías lavas rosas del disco Siroco. Por ejemplo, Parrita fue uno de los que más se inspiró en melodías de Paco, ¿no? Vamos a escuchar La Cachava, que está inspirado este fragmento en la taranta Fuente y Caudal del disco Fuente y Caudal. Y uno de los más curiosos es cómo se inspira el compositor y productor Emmanuel Rufinengo, que fue uno de los productores de varios discos de Alejandro Sanz, y también fue productor y arreglista en el disco Cañeilla de Nia Pastori. Él hace el piano del Temacay, en fin, es un italiano, un verdadero fenómeno. Y él, en este tema de Ketama, que se titula Alguna vez, se inspiró en esta falseta de los fandangos de Huelva, Aires Choqueros, del disco Fuente y Caudal. Un abrazo grande y que viva Paco por siempre.
Paco de Lucía sentía que en cada trabajo debía decir algo nuevo. Después de interpretar temas de Manuel de Falla, El amor brujo, en 1978, de estar de gira con su sexteto, en 1981, aparece Solo quiero caminar. un disco con temas muy potentes que traen nuevos instrumentos al flamenco. Escuchamos por primera vez el cajón, que Paco descubre en una de sus giras en Perú a finales de los 70. Rubén Dantas es el percusionista brasileño encargado de tocarlo. Y junto a ellos, esa flamenquísima flauta de Jorge Pardo, el bajo preciso y sutil de Carles Benavent y sus hermanos, la guitarra de acompañamiento de Ramón de Algeciras y la voz de Pepe de Lucía. Ellos son el Paco de Lucía Sextet, una formación musical inspiradísima, redonda, llena de creatividad y de atrevimiento. Esta vez el sonido es diferente, es fresco, compacto, salvaje y flamenco. También se publica el disco Friday Night in San Francisco, fruto de su unión con John McLaughlin y Al Di Meola, otro punto de inflexión en su carrera, un escaparate al mundo. En 1987 publica Sirocco, para muchos el disco más impactante de su carrera. Vuelve el sonido viejo, pero logra hacer algo nuevo y su guitarra suena, según el poeta Félix Grande, como un alarido mundial. Aquí dedica un tema maravilloso a su gran maestro, el Niño Ricardo, uno de los guitarristas flamencos más importantes de la historia. Sirocco suena flamenco, luminoso y andaluz. La tradición se siente, se respeta y se renueva. Si es que, como reconocen artistas como José Mercé o Tomatito, Paco contribuyó con su guitarra a que el flamenco sea hoy patrimonio inmaterial de la humanidad. En ese Sirocco encontramos la Barrosa, referente del toque por alegrías para muchos guitarristas de todo el mundo que se forman aprendiendo de su técnica, como el ítalo-libanés Luciano Gons en el Centro de Artes Escénicas Rebollar, una academia de Sevilla a la que acuden cada año alrededor de unos 40 estudiantes que, como él, aprenden del guitarrista Eduardo Rebollar. Tras su paso por el centro, ahora es Luciano quien enseña el arte de la guitarra desde su residencia en Japón. El periodista Carlos Fuentes recoge que a finales de los 80, cuando la música moderna de la nueva ola frisaba su inflexión y nadie sabía que luego llegaría el indie cantado en inglés, de pronto algunos jóvenes aspirantes a músicos se fijaron en las posibilidades de la guitarra española y el cajón flamenco. Muestra de ello son bandas como Ketama, Veneno, formado por Kiko Veneno, Raimundo Amador y Rafael Amador, o Pata Negra, el grupo que formaron los hermanos Amador tras su disolución. Artistas que contribuyeron al desarrollo y a la fusión del flamenco, mezclándolo con el rock y el blues. Después, Smash, Triana, Silvio, más tarde Alameda, Medina Azahara combinaron su rock progresivo con las palmas, la percusión y sus quejíos. La Barbería del Sur o No me pises que llevo chanclas, creadores del agropop. Pepe Vejines es su vocalista.
Bueno, pues hay una anécdota muy curiosa que la voy a contar desde aquí, desde la playa de Cádiz, que tanto amaba Paco. Y es que estando grabando yo en los estudios Cinearte de Madrid, bueno, eran días muy largos de grabación y a mediodía solíamos dormir un poquito de siesta. Yo la dormía debajo de un piano, que había yo un Steinway Sound inmenso, y un buen día pues resulta que estando yo echando mi descanso, empezaron a tirar de la pierna. Yo que soy Paco, mi guitarrista se llamaba Paco y era bastante travieso, que tirándome de la pierna le tiré una patada y yo que me va a partir la mano, y resulta que cuando vine era Paco de Lucía. Le llegó a partir la mano a Paco de Lucía. Y bueno, y entonces la verdad es que fue muy emocionante porque Paco iba a pedirnos el estudio durante 2 días porque Camarón se estaba muriendo ya en Nueva York, precisamente. Así que le dejamos los 2 días en el estudio y pudo terminar Potro de Rabia y Miel. Así que nada, viva Paco siempre.
Paco estuvo en contacto con la música moderna, con el jazz, la música latinoamericana, la música española, el folclore, la música clásica, la copla y la electrónica. Yaván, Al Di Meola, John McLaughlin, Chick Corea, Larry Coryell. Su influencia en el pop hizo que algunos artistas incorporaran elementos de su música en sus obras, como la colaboración de Sting con Paco en el álbum The Journey and the Labyrinth, The Music of John Dowland, o el Have You Ever Really Loved the Woman, con el canadiense Bryan Adams para la banda sonora de la película Don Juan de Marco. En España destaca su contribución para el álbum Alevosía de Luis Eduardo Aute en 1995, donde fusiona su maestría flamenca con la sensibilidad poética de Aute en el tema Tiritando. Sus colaboraciones con Alejandro Sanz, con su sobrina Malú, uniones que ilustran cómo su genialidad dejó una huella en el panorama musical más amplio y se metió en nuestros poros. Su obra llegó a todos los rincones del mundo, inspirando a artistas que hoy siguen esa senda de experimentación. Artistas como Rosalía, Rocío Márquez y Bronquio, La Plazuela, De la Fuente o María José Yergo. En resumen, Paco de Lucía ha dejado una marca universal y duradera en la música y en el ámbito de la guitarra y el flamenco en particular. Gracias a la versatilidad de este fabuloso artista, su huella aún perdura y su esencia y su espíritu resuena hoy en la escena musical global.
Sé que cuando pase el tiempo quedará mi alma sonando en el viento. Solo tengo un pensamiento, que la vida es corta, pasa en un momento. Mi Paco se fue a La Habana tiene su parque La Ola.
Well, thank you so much, Lourdes, for your contribution. I mean, your interviews with gathering all these people who met or collaborated with Paco. This is fantastic. We will have time for questions at the end of the session. So right now, without any further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Benjamin Lapidus. He is a Grammy-nominated musician who has performed and recorded throughout the world as a band leader and supporting musician. As a scholar, he has published widely on Latin music. He's a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and also here at the Graduate Center, the CUNY Graduate Center, where he right now is the head of the ethnomusicology program. His new album, and ninth as a band leader, is titled Blues for Ochun 2023 and features Lapidus playing the war guitar, a touch-style instrument. I want to learn more about this guitar, definitely. Lapidus' 2021 book, New York and the International Sound of Latin Music, 1940-1990, published by University Press of Mississippi, remains in the top 50 salsa books on Amazon and has become a popular reference text for scholars and fans of Spanish Caribbean music in New York. Ben is going to be speaking about Entre Dos Aguas. We have heard some of that just now. Entre Dos Aguas, an examination of Paco de Lucia's musical connections to the Americas. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Buenos días. Para la gente que no entiende ni un chin de inglés, que hay unos cuantos aquí y en Zoomlandia, voy a tratar de resumir algunos puntos clave en menos de 25 palabras cuando tengo chance. But for the most part, I'll be reading in English. Born Francisco Sanchez Gomez in 1947, Paco de Lucia also performed under the stage name Algeciras, which means the Green Island or Peninsula in Gibraltar, and it's taken from the Arabic Al-Hasira Al-Khadra. De Lucia was born and raised on this piece of land between two waters, and in various interviews he has expressed this is what the phrase Entre Dos Aguas means to him personally. He also contended that he needed to be near the sea and near the water for his own mental and spiritual well-being. This could also explain his personal impetus for visiting many countries in Latin America, connecting with the local culture, and even spending long periods of time in Mexico and Cuba during the end of his life. Here in the Americas, and in particular the Spanish-speaking Americas, the term Dos Aguas implies the connection between the Old World and the New World, Spain and the Americas, as well as Africa and the Americas. Thus, the term Dos Aguas implies more than just two sources. Entonces estamos hablando de África, América, España y donde sea que estamos conectados. Built into the iconic 1973 recording of Paco de Lucia's song Entre Dos Aguas from the album Fuente y Caudal, we can find a lot of connections to the Americas that would manifest through the musician's long and illustrious career. Today, I'm only going to focus on two aspects of that connection, the first being the incorporation of musical elements from the Americas in Paco de Lucia's music, and the second is Paco de Lucia's engagement with musicians from the Americas. So as a scholar and musician who studies New York City's influence on Spanish Caribbean music and other musical scenes, I'm aware of the force our city exerts on both its musical visitors and residents. For example, the tango master Astor Piazzolla spent his formative years in New York City, and this profoundly affected his work in terms of its dialogue with jazz and Spanish Caribbean musical influences. The same can be said of the Puerto Rican composer and musician Rafael Hernandez around World War I, and for countless others. Therefore, I suggest that while music of the Spanish-speaking Americas was heard in Spain, it was more likely that Paco de Lucia would have encountered much more Spanish Caribbean and Latin American music during his early travels to New York City as a teenager in the 1960s, simply due to its ubiquity. Paco de Lucia returned to New York to perform regularly throughout his career. In the late 1950s and 1960s, all kinds of Latin American music experienced a global commercial boom. A number of hit records were made by New York City-based artists such as Edie Gourmet, who collaborated with Trio Los Panchos, Tito Puente, Abbey Lane, Tito Rodriguez, and many others. For De Lucia, the physical connection to the Americas began in his teenage years. In 1962, at the age of 14, he began touring throughout the United States with his brother as part of Jose Greco's New York City-based group, and Greco's group traveled internationally, spending considerable time in New York, and young Paco instructed his family to send all of his mail to New York even when he was on tour. On his first trip, Paco de Lucia performed with Jose Greco on the Ed Sullivan Show in New York. would also connect with the legendary flamenco guitarist Agustín Castellón Campos, better known as Sabicas, at the Granados restaurant on 125 McDougal Street in the West Village. I attached the menu so you could just dig the prices. Paco de Lucia later expressed that he felt comfortable with English, and in a letter to his family, he described how watching television helped him improve his language skills while on tour when staying in New York. During this period, de Lucia also traveled to perform in a number of American cities, including Birmingham, Chicago, Tampa, Jacksonville, San Francisco, and St. Louis. While performing in Las Vegas, the young musician and his brother Ramon met the original Hollywood Rat Pack, including the chairman of the board himself, Frank Sinatra. And Paco de Lucia also performed in Mexico and other Latin American countries with Jose Greco. In 1965, Paco de Lucia recorded the album 12 Éxitos para dos guitarras flamenca with Ricardo Mondrego. The choice of material shows a modest interaction with the music from Cuba and Venezuela mixed in with Spanish material. The first track is Malagueña by the Cuban composer Ernesto Lecuona, and the arrangement includes rattles, although no one is credited with playing them. The third piece on the record is Maria de la O, which was written by a Spanish composer, but was actually first recorded by the Cuban zarzuela singer Pilar Arcos in 1935. This version also features uncredited hand claps and bells. And the fourth song is the unofficial anthem of Venezuela, Moliendo Café, which was composed in 1958 by Jose Manso or his nephew Hugo Blanco, depending on whose story you believe. This version of Moliendo Café also has hand claps and castanets. In 1966, Paco de Lucia joined Antonio Gades' flamenco dance company for a tour of the Americas, and during the group's trips to Brazil that year, he claimed, according to Juan Jose Tellez, who's going to talk about this, I hope, that once when he was in Brazil, he encountered the bossa nova, which helped him bring a new air and new harmonies to flamenco. In 1967, Mondrego and de Lucia recorded a follow-up album to 12 Éxitos para dos guitarras flamenco that was titled Dos Guitarras Flamenco en América Latina. This album featured music from Argentina, Mexico, Cuba, Brazil, and Peru. Side 1 starts with Cielito Lindo from Mexico and continues with Alma Llanera by the Venezuelan composer Pedro Gutierrez. Their third track is Luis Bonfas Maña de Carnaval, and the fourth track is another Mexican song, El Jarabe Tapatío. Track 5 is La Flor de la Canela, written by Chabuca Grande in 1950, and it's arguably one of the most well-known songs from Peru. According to Granda, it was inspired by a woman in the Barranco neighborhood of Lima, and from 1953 through 2017, it has been recorded by artists from throughout Spain and the Americas over, I don't know how many times. We have Bola de Nieve, Caetano Veloso, Julio Iglesias, Ima Sumac, La Lupe, Rubén Blades. All of them have recorded this. De Lucia's real interest in the Afro-Peruvian cajon came from his introduction to this particular piece of music when he saw Chabuca perform with the cajon at the Spanish embassy in Peru. Another track, A Pesar de Todo, also features a Cuban bongo. Side 2 of the album starts with the Cuban composer Ernesto Lecuona's Siboney. Track 2 is the 1932 song Granada by the Mexican composer Agustín Lara, which many artists recorded, including Frank Sinatra, who released his own version right there in 1961. The third track is another Chabuca Grande called Fina Estampa that she wrote in 1956. Track 5, Malagueña Salerosa, is from the regional genre of northeastern Mexico, Son Huasteco, and was written by Elpidio Ramirez and Pedro Galindo in 1947. This song has since been recorded by probably 200 artists since then. The last track on the album is the 1931 Tango by Gardel and Manuel Romero, Tomo y Obligo, and it's notable that this entire album features an uncredited bongocero, a bongo player, and some other rattles and things like that. All of these songs and their composers are national and regional icons, and thus the album, we can think of it as a map. Es un mapa de Latinoamérica y las Américas. So in 1969, Paco de Lucia and his brother, Ramon, recorded another album here, Paco de Lucia y Ramón de Algeciras en Hispanoamérica. This album includes the Cuban bongo on a number of tracks, playing the standard martillo pattern, we call the hammer, associated with son cubano. But the bongocero is again not identified, unfortunately. Other percussion instruments, such as the maracas, are used to accompany the duo on some tracks. The first track, Amapola, was written by Jose Maria Lacalle in 1920, and it was first recorded in Cuba in 1923. Track 2 is Pájaro Chogui, a Paraguayan polka that was written by the Argentinian composer Guillermo Brier, and it features multiple percussionists. Track 3 is Yo Vendo Unos Ojos Negros, which is a well-known folk song from the Chileno repertoire, which is classified as a tonada, and it was probably written down the first time in 1913, but it wasn't recorded until 1940. Track 4 is Pepe Guizar's emblematic Mexican song Guadalajara. Track 5 is Limeña by the Peruvian composer Agustin Armando Polo Campos. Track 6 is Las Mañanitas, which some people sing on their birthday, but it's a traditional Mexican song. And also, side 2 begins with Alma, Corazón y Vida by Adrián Flores Albán. This is followed by Quizás, Quizás, Quizás by the Cuban composer Osvaldo Fares. And the next track is the hit Tico Tico by the Brazilian composer Zequinha de Abreu, followed by Rafael Hernandez's Lamento Borincano, which dates back to 1929. The penultimate track, A Media Luz, is a 1925 tango by Donato and Carlos Lenzi, and the album ends portentously with La Paloma by the Basque composer Sebastián Iradier, which he wrote in 1860 after a visit to Cuba. This album, again, offers the listener another musical map of Pan America. Now, according to an interview with Tellez, Ramon Algeciras claimed that these recordings were all made at the demand of the record company because they featured well-known commercial songs that guaranteed sales and familiarity. Algeciras looked back on these recordings positively, but his brother Paco de Lucia did not, and was in fact embarrassed by them, according to Tellez. No matter what, these recordings demonstrate familiarity and facility with Latin American and Spanish Caribbean music repertoire. In a 2013 interview with Enrique Planas, de Lucia explained that, quote, prior to using the Peruvian cajon, he had used the Cuban conga and bongo, but to him it sounded more Caribbean and did not sound like flamenco. Thus, we can look at these early recordings collectively as a demonstration of the evolution of Paco de Lucia's approach to incorporating percussion and how he would change flamenco. So we have established that Paco de Lucia was conversant with Latin American and Spanish Caribbean composers in the early 1960s. It would make absolute sense that Paco de Lucia would also know popular North American music of the 1960s, since he spent so much time here as a teenager touring the United States. This is significant if we consider the musical material and conception of the song Entre Dos Aguas. And according to José Luis Marín Anula, the melody and chords for Entre Dos Aguas were actually from the Bart Howard song Fly Me to the Moon. The Frank Sinatra and Count Basie version was released in 1964, but there were many other commercial versions, so we'll just hear the first bars of this.
Fly me to the moon, let me swing among the stars. Let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars. In other words, hold my hand. In other words, baby, kiss me. Fill my heart with song, let me sing forevermore. You are all I long for, all I worship and adore. In other words, please be true. In other words, I love you. Fly, fly, fly. What up? Let me sing forevermore, because you are all I long for, all I worship
and adore. In other words, please be true. In other words, I love you.
In his biography, El Hijo de la Portuguesa, Juan José Tellez suggests that De Lucia knew and liked the song Fly Me to the Moon, and that De Lucia and his musicians used the song as a spontaneous improvisation that was recorded in the studio. Entonces eso quiere decir que Fly Me to the Moon era el tema de una descarga que grabaron. Others have posited that some of the source material for Entre dos Aguas was actually taken from the 1973 single Te Estoy Amando Locamente by Las Grecas, and another song called Caramba Carambita by Los Marismeños. However, Paco de Lucia is actually credited as a co-author of Caramba Carambita, and the connection to Te Estoy Amando Locamente is through his friend Filippo Campuzano. Entre dos Aguas featured de Lucia's brother Ramon on second guitar, the bassist Eduardo Gracias, and the percussionist Pepe Ébano on the Cuban bongo. So, born José Luis Ganosa Barrio Nuevo, Pepe Ébano was an Afro-Peruvian percussionist who had been residing in Spain since the mid-1950s and who came from the same Afro-Peruvian neighborhood of Barranco where Chabuca Granda was inspired to write La Flor de la Canela. Ébano can be heard playing on other recordings from the era, particularly on Te Estoy Amando Locamente by Las Grecas, which is right there, along with Tito Duarte on drums, who was the son of the Cuban composer Ernesto Duarte, and it's very possible that Ébano is the bongocero on the aforementioned Algeciras Brothers recordings of the 1960s. We don't have proof. The commercial success of Entre Dos Aguas definitely led Paco de Lucia to further experiment with many other musicians, instruments, and concepts from the Americas, including collaborations with Carlos Santana, Al Di Meola, and Larry Coryell and John McLaughlin. In the early 1980s, he formed a sextet with like-minded musicians, such as the Brazilian percussionist Rubem Dantas, who played the Peruvian cajon. Performances and recordings with Chick Corea also occupied a number of years of De Lucia's career. Additionally, collaborations with musicians in the Americas included Paco de Lucia playing a solo on the Java song Oceano, originally released on the 1989 album Javan. The Brazilian guitar virtuoso Rafael Rabelo also featured De Lucia on the Antonio Carlos Jobim song Samba do Avial on the 1992 album Todos os Tons. In 1990, the two appeared together on Brazilian TV, expressing their mutual admiration for one another.
Depende do que toca, né?
Muito bom.
Gente, a gente está chegando ao final. Um espectador ligou aqui pedindo desesperadamente para você tocar Astúrias. Aí você disse que não lembra mais, né, Rafael?
Eu toquei isso quando era
Pequenininho?
menino.
Então eu queria pedir para você o seguinte, para a gente se despedir aqui em ritmo, assim, de música, deixando a musiquinha no ar, vamos?
Rafael, de verdad que llevo 15 días sin tocar y he venido de España con 14 horas de vuelo y hoy todo el día haciendo entrevistas. Yo no puedo tocar, me da vergüenza tanta gente mirando. Hacer ridículo.
Me da vergüenza.
So they're expressing their mutual admiration for one another. By the end of the 1990s and into the 2000s, De Lucia was spending an extended period of time in Mexico. And at the same time, around the year 2000, the Nuyorican Latin jazz trumpeter and percussionist Jerry Gonzalez established himself in Madrid. After finishing their gigs, local musicians would hang out at the Café Berlin and jam with Gonzalez and his band. So it is clear that Jerry Gonzalez's influence on the contemporary flamenco jazz scene was immense, as many flamenco jazz groups now feature trumpet. And Paco de Lucia first heard a number of the musicians who played in Jerry Gonzalez's flamenco jazz groups, such as Los Piratas de Jazz and El Comando de Clave, while he was hanging out in the Café Berlin. So he subsequently hired some of these musicians when he made some of his new bands, including El Niño Josele, Tomatito, Alain Perez, and Piranha. In 2003, De Lucia recorded a rumba called Casa Bernardo that features both Jerry Gonzalez on trumpet and Alain Perez on bass and vocals. His 2014 album, Canción Andaluza, featured the Venezuelan superstar Oscar de Leon, as well as Alain Perez on a track called Señorita. Toward the very end of his life, Paco de Lucia spent 3 months living in Cuba, as we just heard from Gabriela, in the Siboney neighborhood of La Habana, and even sent his children to attend school at the Liceo Francés. During this time, he attended concerts by various groups like Los Bamban, and De Lucia even traveled to a small town called Manacahisnaga, which is near Trinidad. This is the hometown of the bass player Alain Perez. This is where he was born and raised. He did so actually without telling Perez or anyone else because he was curious and wanted to know what life was like where his young collaborator had come from. Perez was humbled and only learned of the trip after the fact from De Lucia's widow. This final act of curiosity and the openness to further explore the connections between Spain and the Americas demonstrates Paco de Lucia's profound search for new experiences and knowledge of self and of others while embodying the concept of being entre dos aguas. Thank you.
Well, we're learning so much, I guess. Wow, thank you so much, Ben, for your wonderful presentation. We're going to continue with John Moore. John Moore has been on the University of California at San Diego linguistics faculty since 1992. His research has been in the areas of theoretical syntax, lexical semantics, and Spanish linguistics, with recent work on the syntax of Moro, Central Sudan, and Spanish, as spoken in the San Diego-Tijuana border region. Since 2018, Moore has served as the University of California at San Diego's Dean of Undergraduate Education. Previous administrative positions included Department Chair and Provost of John Muir College. Outside academia, Moore has played flamenco guitar semi-professionally for over 50 years, with extended periods studying and performing in Spain. He has released 2 solo CDs, Sin Función, 2008, and Amor de Diosero, 2020. Moore has published on flamenco topics, including several articles and an annotated translation of José Luis Ortiz Nuevo's classic 1001 Historias de Pericón de Cádiz, 1001 Stories of the Pericón de Cádiz. So thank you so much and welcome, John.
This arrow. Well, thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you to Maida and Antoni for organizing this and for inviting and bringing us all together. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm calling Pan-American contributions to flamenco and the role of Paco de Lucia. This is from the perspective of someone who's not a musicologist. I'm a linguist, so I'm going to bring some parallels with language because I think they're actually instructive. And also from the point of view of someone who's been an aficionado now for over half a century and has lived through some of the periods when Paco de Lucia was emerging as an artist and finding his own voice. So I'm going to talk about 2 different types of American influence that went into flamenco. One primarily from North America, although not exclusively from North America, and that is the flamenco in diaspora that we found particularly in New York City. The other is the role of Latin America in pan-Latin popular music. And the previous talk went into some of this in detail. I'm going to be looking at a slightly different aspect of this, so I hope it will be complementary. And I will suggest that Paco de Lucia's music was significantly influenced by both of these American phenomena with respect to flamenco. So flamenco in diaspora, which I think of as dance companies and concert flamenco guitar. This goes actually back quite a ways to the early 20th century. New York became a destination for major Spanish dance companies in the 1920s. So starting with Antonia Mercé, La Argentina, who came in 1928, although I believe she actually had also been here prior to that, and Vicente Escudero in 1932. And this was met with critical acclaim. So there emerged a market in New York City for Spanish dance and Spanish dance companies. Now, this accelerated considerably during the Spanish Civil War in 1936 to 1939, when many companies found themselves sometimes touring outside of Spain, or in the case of Carmen Amaya, having to get out of Spain very quickly. The story about the car that was commandeered when she was on her way to Portugal. And so there we started seeing other dance companies, La Argentinita, Encarnación López and her sister, Pilar López, Antonio Triana, Antonio Rosario, all were performing at various times in the United States with North American tours, and particularly here in New York City. There are extended tours throughout the United States. We heard about Jose Greco. So some of these companies were not led by Spanish dancers, but by people from elsewhere. So Jose Greco, of course, was born in Italy, but raised in New York. And then the Mexican dancer, Manolo Vargas. Many of these worked with the impresario Saul Horak, who was very instrumental in promoting flamenco in Spanish dance in the United States. And Paco de Lucia also worked with Saul Horak. So as a result, a lot of the Spanish dance tradition that we have now throughout flamenco and throughout Spanish dance, and by Spanish dance I mean also Spanish classical dance as well as flamenco, developed outside of Spain, and much of it developed in New York City. So a lot of what we know, what has come to be the tradition of flamenco is actually a North American phenomenon, albeit one by largely Spanish performers in diaspora. Now, when you have Spanish dance, the Spanish dance kind of evolved from being primarily Spanish classical dance and incorporating more elements of flamenco. Once you incorporate elements of flamenco, of course, you need guitarists. And there were several guitarists that came with these dance companies and then ended up settling here in the United States. So, for example, Carlos Montoya, the nephew of Ramon Montoya, accompanied La Argentina, La Argentinita, Vicente Escudero, among others. He settled in the US. He was probably the first major guitarist that settled in the US in 1936. Sabicas was part of the tour with Carmen Amaya, came first to Argentina, then spent time in Mexico, and ended up settling in New York in 1955. Mario Escudero, he worked with Antonio and Rosario, Vicente Escudero, Carmen Amaya, Jose Greco, among many others. He toured the Americas in the early 50s and then settled in New York in 1961. So these are major guitarists that essentially were living as expatriates in the United States. Now, flamenco guitar, of course, is often within Spain primarily thought of as an art that is used to accompany cante and then also to accompany baile. But flamenco also is played as a solo instrument. Guitar is played as a solo genre. And this is actually, people tend to think this is a recent phenomenon, but it's been around since the Café Cantante period. So for example, Paco de Lucena was famous for his guitar solos in the late 19th century. Ramon Montoya made the first recordings of flamenco solos early in the 20th century. And Nino Ricardo, who was was famous as an accompanist, as was Ramon and as was Paco de Lucena, but also was well known as a soloist. Didn't really record much in the solo genre until the 40s, but nevertheless, his work is extremely influential in the history of solo flamenco guitar. What's interesting, though, is the genre of concert flamenco guitar, concert solo flamenco guitar. And this actually seems to have begun with Carlos Montoya in 1956 in a concert that he performed in the Brooklyn Academy of Music. Now, by this, it's not that solo flamenco guitar was not performed in Spain, but the idea of one single guitarist sitting on stage in a large concert hall, this was something that was a phenomenon that was pioneered with Carlos Montoya. Carlos Montoya became very, very famous. It's interesting because if you think about the sort of the critical evaluation of flamenco guitarists, Carlos Montoya has never really reached the top, but he was probably the most popular guitarist in the United States throughout the late 20th century. Others followed in the same genre, so of course Sabicas, Mario Escudero, and then later Juan Serrano. So this genre of a flamenco guitar soloist alone on a concert stage in a concert hall really is a 20th century North American phenomenon, which is interesting. Now, of course, along with that was a very extensive solo flamenco guitar discography. Now, I remember as a teenager in the early 1970s when I was starting to play flamenco, and I had read Don Purin's Art of Flamenco, and I was just wishing I could find some cante. Going to the music stores, and there was none. There was essentially nothing. Occasionally you'd find something. The few records that I have are imprinted in my brain because I listened to them a million times. What you did find, you found a lot of Carlos Montoya. You found quite a bit of Sabicas. You found a little bit of Mario Escudero, a little bit of Juan Serrano, and actually quite a bit of Manitas de Plata. And that's what all the flamenco sections had. And if you ask an American who's not necessarily an aficionado of flamenco what flamenco is, first they'll say it's flamingo, and then they'll think it's some kind of dance and they'll do some stupid looking thing where they stamp their feet. Or they'll think it is solo flamenco guitar, and in particular playing malagueña. That's kind of the image of what flamenco is. The idea of cante is completely out of the realm of what people in this country outside of flamenco think about flamenco. And it's partly, I think, because of this phenomenon. Okay, so here I want to have a little a little something about language, since I'm a linguist. So language and music are both cultural artifacts. They're both transmitted across generations, and the crucial thing is that both of them are always changing from generation to generation. And because they're always changing, it's the case that each generation makes innovations, and those innovations are very odious to the previous generation. Except the problem is that the previous generation is not going to prevail in that argument. So, so this is something that happens with language. It also happens with music. And there's also this notion of a critical period. People learn their language essentially up until puberty. After puberty, it becomes difficult to acquire a second language. And the variety of language that you speak is really determined by your peer group during your adolescence, your late adolescence. Also, the type of music that probably you feel most comfortable with is the music that you grew up with around your late adolescence and your early 20s. And so it's very difficult for someone to really understand the music of the generation that comes before, because you really were imprinted on that music in your late teens. And it's very similar to language. Now, languages can be, sometimes you can have diasporic languages. And this is a case when you have a speech community that's separated from the standard language, undergoes its own changes in diaspora. Now, notice both languages are changing, but they're changing in different ways. And so you can have this situation where you have innovations in the diasporic language, but you don't have the same innovations that the standard language has, so it kind of seems like you're speaking a more archaic version of the standard language because it hasn't undergone those changes. A classic example of this is Ladino, which is the Spanish variety spoken by the Sephardic diaspora. It has its own innovations. It's not the same as the Spanish that left Spain in the late 15th century, but it does preserve the sibilant system that was common in the late 15th century in Andalusia. So, for example, they have 4 sibilant phonemes. So you have casa, which means hunt. You have casa, which means house. You have kasha, which means box. And then you don't have a similar one, but viejo, for example, for old. And this was the 4 sibilant system that you had in what was kind of the dialect that was going to become the Sasaista dialect of Andalusia, but it hadn't had the voice reduction. Well, similarly, you can think of Sabicas as actually having a diasporic dialect of flamenco, because Sabicas left in 1936 and never came back to Spain until much, much later. He was very much even though Sabicas in his interviews always said he had no teachers, all his music was his own, he was clearly very heavily influenced by Ramon Montoya. And also, he didn't have the later influences that happened in Spain, so he really didn't have the influence of Nino Ricardo. Of course, he developed his own style, and it wasn't exactly the same as Ramon Montoya, but it was a similar diasporic version of flamenco. And you can see that in comments that were made by Enrique Morente when he recorded with Sabicas. He said he felt like he'd gone back to the Villa Rosa of Chacon and Montoya. Okay, so Paco de Lucia, as we've heard before, toured with Jose Greco. In fact, his first major solo was that Luquena Malagueña, which he played in the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles, which is like kind of ironic. His meeting with Sabicas and Mario Escudero is the stuff of legend, and we all will hear about that a lot here today. But what's crucial is that Sabicas became an important mentor for Paco and Mario Escudero. So he had his background based on Nino Ricardo's toque, which was the bass that he learned with his brother and his father. But he was very impressed with the sound that Sabicas had, the clean technique, the speed. This was something that was new to him. And his first solo album, La Fabulosa Guitarra de Paco Lucia, was built on a Ricardo foundation, but it did show clear influences from Sabicas, and it included Impetu, which was a composition by Mario Escudero. So the influence there is clear. And then also, a little bit more indirect influence is that he adopted the solo concert approach, the approach of a single guitarist on stage in a concert hall. With large concert hall recitals, beginning around 1970 in the Palacio de la Música in Barcelona, the Teatro de la Zarzuela, then here in Carnegie Hall, many concert halls across Europe, and then, of course, most famously, the concert in 1975 in Madrid's Teatro Real, which was the first time flamenco was presented in that venue and was very controversial, but was really a watershed moment. Paco did note, however, that the difficulty coming to Teatro Real was kind of strange given that he was playing at all the concert halls of equivalent stature elsewhere in Europe and in the United States. So, in the summary about the diaspora, he participated in the dance company that was characteristic of flamenco in diaspora. He was also greatly influenced by the guitarists whose work had developed in the diaspora, and he adopted the solo concert genre that was founded in the diaspora. So the diaspora was a major influence on Paco. Now I'm going to shift gears and talk about something completely different. This is similar to the previous talk, although with a little bit of a different focus, what I'm going to call Pan-Latin popular music. So, flamenco evolved from a fusion of various musics of Andalusia, but it gelled around the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, with a few dozen flamenco forms, or a dozen or so flamenco forms. And most of them are built around the Andalusian cadence or a major key. There's a few that also employ the minor key, but they're relatively few. And many aficionados, and I think perhaps American aficionados in particular, tend to keep a very strict division between what's flamenco and what's popular. So there's this contrast between flamenco and popular music. Nonetheless, people in Spain are consumers of the music that is played on the radio, that's sold in the record store, that they see in the movies, and that will include, even if they are aficionados of flamenco, it will also include popular music. They'll be hearing that popular music constantly. So it exists side by side, and then you have what's called a contact situation. Again, the parallel with language. When you have a bilingual community where you have languages in contact, you have mutual influence between the languages, and you have borrowing back and forth between the languages. So, for example, Spanish has a very large Arabic vocabulary because of a contact situation. English has a very large French vocabulary because of the Norman invasion. But there is a period of bilingualism where people will switch back and forth between languages. And so, for example, in this country it's popularly known as Spanglish when you mix between English and Spanish. Again, people often criticize this. Certainly I've heard lots of Spanish speakers saying either you speak Spanish, speak English, but don't mix them. But the fact is that mixing is inevitable. It's like a natural law that happens in contact situations. So again, you're going to find this contact situation in musical genres, and you're going to get the mutual influence. So what I'm calling Pan-Latin American music is a loose genre of music, often romantic ballads, often in the bolero tradition. They're written by Spanish composers, many of whom from Andalusia, lyrics by Spanish poets, Latin American composers and lyricists, and we just heard in the previous talk a lot of detail about that. They're also featured in Spanish language film, particularly the Cine de Oro that was a movie industry from Mexico that was one of the major movie genres of the mid-20th century in the Spanish-speaking world. So again, Spanish audiences, including Spanish flamenco aficionados, would be familiar with this music from popular culture, from the radio, from film, from wherever music is consumed. Now, there's a lot of discussion about couplé, copla andaluza. Couplé originally referred to a type of music, hall music, and copla andaluza evolved out of that. It's often associated with people like Antonio Quintero and Rafael de Leon. It tends to have these very maudlin themes of fallen women and violent jealousies. And there's a whole bunch of singers who made their careers singing copla. So Concha Piquer, Juanita Reina, Lola Flores, Sarita Montiel, Isabel Pantoja, Maria Jimenez, many of them. And many of them had a crossover into flamenco as well. Now, when we talk about couplé and flamenco, it really refers to any popular song that's not from this quote-unquote standard flamenco repertoire that's sung with guitar accompaniment. Generally, it's embedded in either in bulerías, rumba, or sometimes tango compás. There's some early examples of this. So, for example, Nini de los Peines recorded Cielito Lindo por bulerías. Maria de la Carmen Amaya recorded Maria de la O, also for bulerías. And one of my favorites, which is not as well known, is Antonio Chaqueta singing Quizás, Quizás, Quizás with his gravelly voice and his intonation, which if you haven't heard it, look it up. It's worth listening to. Okay, now, couplets are ubiquitous in flamenco, but it really it's been taken to a high art in Utrera. In fact, there's this often heard quote, even though I don't know the actual quote and I don't know who said it, but that La Bernarda de Utrera could sing the telephone book por bulerías. Her sister, Fernanda de Utrera, is famous for couplets, for example, Se nos rompió el amor from Manuel Alejandro. And, you know, there is a lot of criticism of couplets as not being pure flamenco, but it's pretty ironic that La Fernanda, probably the greatest interpreter of soleá in pure flamenco of the 20th century, is also known for her couplet, her interpretation of couplets. She didn't find it not flamenco to sing couplets. Now, it's too bad that Maida just left the room because I think it was 1984, I went to the Feria de Morón, and Maida was there, actually. And Bambino's brother was performing with some guitarists, and it was a great performance, and he was singing a lot of couplets. There was an aficionado, an older aficionado. He wanted to make sure that me, as a foreigner, understood. He grabbed me by the shoulder and said, "Pero eso no es flamenco puro, eh? This isn't real flamenco." And I had had a few months in the years, and I turned around and I said, "Sí, pero muy flamenco," because it was very flamenco. Now, speaking of Bambino, Miguel Vargas Jimenez, also from Utrera, from the same Gitano Panini family as Fernanda and Bernarda, was famous for his couplets. He really took it to a new level. He developed this couplet tradition, these popular songs that were sung and danced with absolute, sorry, Beta, I was just talking about when we were at the Feria de Morón together. He sang and danced these with a really hard-driving guitar accompaniment. He usually had 3 guitarists, and they were some of the best guitarists around. Palmas, often bongo accompaniment, and pretty much all bulerías and rumba. Now, he came up through the Tabao circuit in Madrid in the 1960s and 70s and has a very large discography. Now, if you look at where his music comes from, much of it comes from Spanish composers. So, you know, Miedo, Tengo Miedo, that's Juan Solano and Rafael de León. Déjame en paz, no me de guerra, that's José Antonio Ochaito and Juan Solano. Te estoy queriendo tanto, Manuel Alejandro, the same one that did Se nos rompió el amor, and his wife, Ana Magdalena, among others. But then, significantly, there are a lot of Latin American composers, because this is part of this pan-Latin popular music. So Armando Manzanero, Adoro, Fernando Zinaldo Maldonado, Payaso, a famous interpretation, Marco Antonio Muñiz, Arremtida, Luis Demetrio, Boy, and you know, some of these, for example, Payaso and Boy, were featured in Cine de Oro movies. So, for example, Boy, you can see this in a movie called Diablos del Cielo, which is a movie about stunt pilots. And you see Javier Solis wearing a flight jacket in a bar, playing the guitar and singing Boy in a very kind of slow and laid-back way, very different from the way that Bambino performed it. Many others. One of Bambino's most famous songs, La Pared, that was Roberto Anglero, Puerto Rican composer and salsero, also known for his satirical song, Si Dios Fuera Negro, and many others. So a lot of this music was Latin American music, a lot of it was Spanish music, but it was all this kind of popular music, this pan-Latin popular music. Now, I just want to have a little sideline on the connection between Utrera and Morón. So there's been a long-standing connection between the guitar-centric flamenco community in Morón and the cante-centric flamenco in Utrera. So, of course, Diego del Gastor was a frequent accompanist of La Fernanda and La Bernarda, as well as Perate de Utrera. Diego's nephew, Paco del Gastor, worked for many years with Bambino. He was Bambino's guitarist for many years. And he also frequently accompanied Fernanda and Bernarda, including a live performance in Paris that resulted in a famous recording. And in fact, at that same Feria de Morón, now that Mira's left the room, after the performance of that caseta, we went to another caseta and we listened to Paco del Gastor play for Fernanda all night until 6 in the morning. Again, the extended Panini family, often with the last names Vargas or Peña, include Miguel Funi, very closely related to Morón, Fernanda Bernarda, Inés Bacán, many others who had close ties to Morón. And in fact, last fall I went to a fiesta outside of Sevilla with Paco's brother, Juan del Gastor, and Mari Peña. So again, traditional flamenco is really built around the Andalusian cadence and major keys. The introduction of couplets expands the possibilities to include chord progressions from popular music. So it really opens the palette that's available to flamenco. Paco del Gastor, in his book, mentioned that he learned tonos from working with Bambino. Now, when you're accompanying a singer and suddenly they leave traditional flamenco and suddenly sing a couplet, you have to know that couplet in order to accompany it. And I have seen and I have experienced many times where guitarist is floundering around trying to find the chords, not always successfully, so, because you don't happen to know that one. If you know it, then you can nail it. As one person once told me, sí, está muy fácil si cuanto sabe. And I don't know if the other guitarists in this room have experienced this or not, but I certainly have. So along with these new progressions, music from Mexico, the Caribbean, and Brazil brought new notions of harmony, new notions of new musical vocabulary into the realm of flamenco. So Paco participated in this. He moved to Madrid in 1964. He met Paco del Gastor at that time because Don Porin in the basement of Gabrieles, had a sort of a tertulia where he would bring various artists to perform. And he brought Paco del Gastor along with Manolito de la Maria from Alcalá. And that's where Paco de Lucia met him. They became close friends. They had a lot of mutual influence. In fact, Paco Sevilla, who wrote a biography of Paco de Lucia, notes that on the first record, the Bulerías had some influence from Paco del Gastor, which is interesting because it shows that there's a Morón connection to Paco de Lucia's music, even though in later life, Paco actually had some less than kind things to say about Diego del Gastor, but I suspect that was because he just got sick of Americans going on about Diego constantly, which some of us have unfortunately done. And then again, we had, in our last talk, had a very, very detailed discussion of Paco and his brother in the Latin American songs that he recorded. So in general, the music of Latin America, which is misspelled in there, including boleros, rancheras, bossa nova, was popular in Spain and played a role in expanding the harmonic possibilities of flamenco in general. Paco was coming of age around that time when this was all going on. He was present in this mix, and its influence can be heard from the late 60s to early 70s. And listening to some of the early recordings, I think there's kind of a big break between La Fabulosa Guitarra and then the next solo albums. In particular, if you listen to Plazuela from Recital de Guitarra in 1972, you can really hear Paco's distinctive sound starting to emerge, where he has counterpoint, countertime, the tirando chords that he was famous for throughout. And I think that marks the emergence of Paco's distinctive style. Now, others will discuss and have discussed, the last talk also discussed Paco's contributions with jazz musicians. This was a major factor in the jazzification of flamenco. His quote-unquote discovery of the Afro-Peruvian cajon now has really permanently changed flamenco in flamenco instrumentation. What's kind of interesting is the solo format that he adopted from North America kind of gave way to an ensemble performance. So what it used to be is he would play alone on a stage all the way through his concert and then bring a few people up at the end to do Entre Dos Aguas. Now he plays a in recent concerts, he would play a rondeña solo as his first number, and then would bring an ensemble in and play pretty much all of the concert as an ensemble. In this solo format, actually, I think has diminished in recent years in flamenco. There are still people who give solo recitals. It hasn't changed, but there's a lot more ensemble performance. So again, we heard this earlier. Ida y vuelta has always been part of flamenco, but I think what this shows is that it continued through the 20th century in new and subtle ways, and Paco de Lucia has been a major figure in this transformation. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, John. Wonderful talk. We have about 15 minutes for some Q&A. The only thing is that if there are questions, and I suspect there are some, we need to use the microphones. So thank you so much, Meira. And there are a couple of other microphones. So any questions for any of the presenters, for Lourdes, Ben, and John? Any questions? And also actually, I think it would be a good idea if the three presenters would come here. If you don't mind, John and Lourdes and Ben.
A question?
Yes. Now, if you answer any question, just use the microphone. You can sit. Okay, I think there is a question already. Thank you.
I'm trying to phrase this. This is really, I guess, for Professor Moore, speaking about language and a kind of duality. And I wondered if you could speak to anything about New York versus California on this.
Great question.
Is this on? Yes. I probably shouldn't go there because first of all, I don't know enough. Obviously, we have regional varieties. Some of those regional varieties, I think, have been leveled a bit through media. I think it's an interesting question how people in the diaspora, the flamencos in the diaspora, managed with English. I wasn't here in New York. I wasn't here talking to them, so I don't know how they spoke. But clearly, they would have been here learning English in New York, and presumably that would have been an influence on their language. We speak a little bit differently in California. I'm not originally from California, but I think I grew up there long enough that it's part of my variety.
And we have, let me go to...
Yes, other questions?
Hi. My question is directed to all of you guys. I am right now trying to think about genealogies of legibility, specifically when it comes to the female dancing body. And so, having been reading a little bit on Argentina and Carmen Amaya in particular as they performed in New York, I was wondering what made them so popular. And popularity here, I'm understanding as a mixture between innovation, obviously, something new has to be brought to the table, but also some kind of legibility. It has to resonate with what the audience and what a very rich impresario would be interested in as well. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about what antecedents or precedents for them as artists in North America would have been. Yeah, I don't know. It might be a difficult question, but.
So are you talking about specifically flamenco, or can it be other people?
In terms of perceiving them that eventually made them as flamenco dancers possible, legible? Does that make sense?
I mean, the examples that for me come to mind in New York in the early part of the century, well, earlier in the 20s, people like Renee and Estela, who danced rumba, Cuban rumba dancers, in New York. Then you had the impresario and dancer Princess Aurelia Benskina. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She was Panamanian, although in some places her heritage would suggest that she was Cuban, but she danced all styles of Afro-Caribbean dance, and she also danced with the Asada Dafour troupe and toured around the United States. So she was based in Harlem. I talk about her a little bit in my book. I think that there's a scholar who just passed, Yesenia Sedier. I don't know if you're familiar with her at all. She did a lot of work on dancers in that time period. I mean, I can't speak with expertise about the flamenco dancers, but at least the Afro-Caribbean dancers, those are the folks who are. It's good to have a musical ring. Those are the folks who are in New York City at that time period and the dancing scene. But they were also, not only were they dancing here, but they were also touring. So you can see Renee and Estela dancing in Mexican films such as Tierra Brava, and other Mexican films featured Cuban artists like Compay Segundo and so forth, performing, in the middle of these dramatic films. There would be a musical break and a musical scene, and that's where those dancers would be seen. And there was also a dance kind of teaching thing that was happening here in the 20s and 30s. There's a gentleman who's, I think he's 104, 105 years old, who's still alive, named Vincent Lavelli, and he was very active in promoting dance here in New York, particularly Spanish Caribbean dance in that time period. I mean, the other people got involved after that, but he's chronicled some of that experience and some of the back and forth between Cuba, Puerto Rico, and New York at that time.
Mm-hmm. I think part of it is the legibility comes from this exoticization of the dance and based on stereotypes. So I think that can really feed into the popularity. And I think Benitez de Plata is a great example. He was not really part of the Spanish flamenco tradition. He played a guitar in France, and his flamenco was not really the same as what you'd find in Spain. But he looked like a Gitano. I think he may have had a gold tooth, and he was huge in Carnegie Hall. And I think they really played up the fact that he was exotic. And I think with Spanish dances it's the same. And in the Mexican Cine de Oro, they often would have, some of the movies would have Lola Flores, and sometimes some people from the Ortega family would be in those movies, and they would be the quote-unquote gypsy dancers. And again, it was based on some stereotypes that existed in Mexico with respect to Spain. I remember the Mexican actor Mantequilla in one of those movies saying, all they're doing, they're singing, que se murió mi madre, y esto se llama una fiesta? Right? So,
was Nenon Sevilla a gypsy character?
Who?
Nenon Sevilla, was. I could be wrong, but I think Nenon Sevilla, who was a Cuban dancer, actress who acted in the whole cabareteria era of Mexican films. I believe there was a movie where she was also supposed to be a gypsy, but she was dancing rumba.
Right. And of course, all the mambo and Perez Prado in those Mexican movies was also big, and I think that also was part of based on stereotypes in many ways.
I'm actually going to jump in here too, just really quickly, and just to say, Carmen Amaya, what she did was she just de-emphasized the cante altogether, and that was a way I think that people could relate to her, because what they were hearing was the rhythm, and they, could be, swept up in the rhythm without having to worry about all those whiny people sounding weird. I think Arturo had a question.
Speaking of the flamencos and language, learning English, Sabikis' brother used to be around the Sala. Sabikis wasn't that readily available. But and his brother would always say, he would eat always at the Taza de Oro, Latino restaurant on 14th Street. But when he wasn't able to find the Latino restaurant, he would complain in Spanish, you know, all I ever order is ham and egg, because all I ever learned to say in English is ham and egg, ham and egg.
Well, thank you very much, the three of you, for your wonderful presentations. I just had some questions. If I will try to be brief.
Yes.
Yeah, the first one for Lourdes is about the... te la puedo decir en español si quieres. Sobre los archivos que tiene Radio Nacional, ¿no? Televisión Española, que hay una cantidad de vinilos, cassettes y ¿no? grabaciones que se han mostrado hoy aquí, ¿no? Que nos ha mostrado Benjamin. No, I'm talking, sorry, in English.
Okay.
No, about the...
Yes. The question is about the musical archives of the National Radio in Spain, and the question is for Lourdes, who is a professional radio personality, actually.
Bueno, yo puedo hablar de la cadena SER también. Ay, perdón. Que sí, indudablemente todo lo que hay de archivo es que ilustra el universo de Paco de Lucía y todo lo que él difundió, ¿no? A lo largo del mundo. Hablaba antes de Sabicas, claro, Sabicas lo trajo aquí a Estados Unidos, pero él se encargó de expandirlo. Va.
Yes. We're going to translate.
I'm going to translate it really badly, and then I'm going to give Paco the microphone back. So, dilo otra vez, perdón.
No, que es una muestra, ese archivo de todo lo que hizo, de la dimensión que tenía ese universo y esas actuaciones que empezó en la televisión y donde empezó la televisión a tener un papel muy importante en el mundo de la música y la difusión.
Yeah, so there's a huge archive in the radio, in the Spanish radio.
And television.
Y televisión, él ha nombrado televisión.
It becomes television, you know, gradually. And there's actually an important role that New York plays in that, because Brooks Zern is the one who recovered Rito y Geografía, all of those videos. He was the one who recovered those for us.
La radio era muy poderosa en aquella época, más incluso que la televisión. Y de hecho no ha muerto la radio, sigue viva. Era muy importante y el papel de los locutores, eran prescriptores. Y yo creo que, no sé si al final lo he reflejado en el vídeo que he traído, la radio fue el punto de inflexión, el empuje que indudablemente la obra estaba y era muy buena, pero estaba a punto de descatalogarse ese disco. Y fue Jesús Quintero quien decidió hablar con la discográfica, decir que esto tiene que sonar, pero lo hizo por los cauces del pop. Se metió en la radio comercial, en la radio musical, salió del flamenco sin perder su esencia de flamenco, porque era una rumba, pero con su raíz flamenca. Y ese fue el punto del éxito y lo que hizo que Paco de Lucía sea ahora quien es, ese empujoncito que le hizo llegar al gran público, llenar el Teatro Real de Madrid con gente que no era especialista en flamenco.
So I'm going to try to translate that. So Lourdes is saying that the radio was actually really, really key to this whole thing. And in particular, when we think about Entre dos Aguas, which was such an important song, it was about to be forgotten,
taken out of catalog.
Taken out of the catalog. And someone whose name I didn't recognize
Jesús
promoted
Quintero.
it. Jesús Quintero, thank you very much. Debías tú de traducir, Anthony. Brought it out and made it popular, and it became something that was heard as everyone has been saying, in kind of pop audiences, not flamenco audiences.
De hecho, la canción se puso y empezó la gente a llamar diciendo que querían escucharla otra vez. Fue un poco ese el origen, ¿no?
Yes, they played the song and then people called her, was it radio at that point or television? Radio, I guess. So they call the radio station, say, please play it again. We want to listen to this again.
Well, thank you very
Yes.
much.
Paco, you have another
yes,
question?
Yes, please, just for the two of you, but thank you so much. I was wondering about these collaborations that you mentioned, Benjamin, and John as well, with all these Latin American musicians who are touring with Paco, like Alain Perez, for example, no? That you were mentioning, how Juan Manuel Cañizares, when he came to the La Complutense, he told me that cuando llueve todos nos mojamos. No? The idea that I was wondering, obviously Paco was having an influence on all those musicians, even the dancers, no? But I'm sure Paco was also taking a little bit of Jerry González or Alain Perez and Rubén Dantas, of course. And the last thing I just want to mention is about these couplets for bulerías, which I'm very interested that it's very interesting how Enrique Encabo's book, I don't know if you know that book, is published by ICMU, and the other day Lucia's was mentioning that the couplets for bulerías were so usual that even Mairena, that you were mentioning, Bernarda Utrera, were doing it even although he was criticizing couplets por bulería, and he saying, no, we need to sing seguirillas, we need to sing soleares, we need to sing tientos. Then in the parties, late at night, he was singing couplets por bulería.
So Juan del Gastor, for example, in a fiesta, all he sings is our couplets. And I think he believes that that's flamenco, and it is flamenco. So I don't think the people who are doing this are making a distinction. I think they believe this is flamenco because they do it in their flamenco way. So I think it's become part of the tradition. By the way, I forgot to mention that Paco actually did also record with Bombino several times.
Very good. Okay, we have time for one more question, maybe.
If there's nobody else, I have a question. Is there anybody else? Go ahead, No, you go. Okay. Oh, okay. I have a question because I'm in an audience, a privileged audience. So one summer when I had the privilege of partying a bunch with Fernanda and Bernarda was singing Este verano en la playa. And then I heard, of course, who I'm obsessed with, Antonio Reyes, Bulerías, and he sings that. And I was just wondering, what does that come from? That's got to be a popular song.
Does anyone know this song, Este verano en la playa?
Este verano en la playa que yo me voy a poner morena. That one. Do you guys know that one? Oh, it's such a great one. And she was singing it all the time. She was singing it every day.
Okay. Well, I
guess just to answer the question.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No,
yes.
It's okay. I mean, so for me, I mean, some people may find it controversial, but Jerry Gonzalez is a mammoth musical figure here in the United States, in New York, huge. His legacy can't be, and his brothers can't be. And I'm also biased because I worked with him and his brother. So growing up here, we look to them for the latest and the greatest developments in Latin jazz. So when he sort of established himself in Spain and then started incorporating, there were a number of Cuban musicians who've been living in Spain for a long time, and that's throughout history. But that sort of young crop, people like Alain, etc., Caramelo, Quique Ferrer, the people who were working with him, he really established this very unique group sound, and he was really, doing interesting things with flamenco and jazz and with Cuban music. And I think the experiments that he was successfully conducting at the Café Berlin and other places with those groups, from what I understand, a lot of people were going there to hang out and to see what was happening. And I know that Paco was hanging out there and hanging out with those musicians. And there are a number of great interviews online. I spoke with Alain Perez before this event, but I figured there was so much good stuff online already. And there's a number of interviews where he really talks about specifically arranging music for Paco de Lucia, Paco sending him facetas, sending him ideas, him, as a challenge, sort of arranging them. Instances where they had maybe some problems on stage. There's a lot. He provides a lot of insight into that relationship, and I think it was really reflected towards the end of his life. Like I said in the paper, the fact that he went to Cuba and he was hanging out and he was going to see all these groups and really digging into the musical scene there. It wasn't the first time he had been there, but it is the mark of a musician like Jerry, like so many other people who was just very open to taking influences from other places and incorporating them into their own music, and then at the same time still making it their own music heard. And I think Cuban musicians, someone like Alain Perez and other musicians who joined his group, it was without a question they were going to have a profound impact on what he produced. But it was still his thing. So I think we can't ever think about like dialects. We can't and influence from diasporas. We can't. That's the bell. Me rindo, me tiro la toalla. We can't ever. We can't talk about music ever in these scenes and without these influences. It's impossible. We have to talk about New York. For this, we have to talk about New York for so many things, and it's all connected. It's all connected.
Definitely. Thank you so much to the three panelists. Thank you again. And thank you to the audience for listening. We have a 15-minute break. I believe there is still coffee and pastries out there. And then we're going to gather and we're going to have two interventions via Zoom and one person on the stage. So that's going to be at 12:05 maybe. Okay, thank you.